James Mattis, the former Defense Secretary who resigned last December in protest of Trump's policies, is currently on what is sure to be a very lucrative book tour. And he's beginning to do some media appearances. And wouldn't you know it, the first of these appearances was an incredibly softball interview on CBS this morning. And maybe the main takeaway from Mattis's overall attitude, as encompassed by his book and his media comments, is that he's maintaining this posture of sort of military rectitude, and because of that, he is going to decline to directly criticize the sitting president. Mattis resigned with some pretty stark criticisms of the sitting president, and yet he kind of maintains this appearance of being above the partisan fray. And I think that there are multiple reasons why this attitude is somewhat incoherent. So I want to play you a couple of clips from the interview this morning that illustrate why.
Mattis left Afghanistan to take command of a Marine division and a mission he never saw coming: the invasion of Iraq.
I was somewhat flabbergasted. I didn't think Saddam could do much in terms of threatening us. There was a problem there, but I thought it could be solved other than us invading them.
His Marines famously toppled the statue of Saddam Hussein, but 9 months later found themselves engulfed by an insurgency.
Move it, hurry!
The enemy was rising everywhere. The tribes had gotten furious. Anyone reading a history book knows what's going to happen at this point. There's going to be violence, and we didn't have enough troops to contain it.
Mattis was in the thick of it, with 29 gunners, drivers, radio operators, and aides who moved with him around the battlefield.
And 17 of those 29 lads would be killed or wounded over the next 4 months, to give you an idea of just how bad it was. And I'm a general. I'm not in the toughest fighting.
The toughest fighting was in the terrorist stronghold of Fallujah, which Mattis was ordered to liberate. He thought it was a mistake to use so much firepower in a city of 300,000.
So you went in to Fallujah, what, against your better judgment?
You've got to do it. I mean, that's why they're called orders. They're not called likes. You don't have to like it. You were ordered to do it.
In the midst of the battle, the images of urban combat became too much for the Bush administration, and Mattis was ordered to call it off.
I could not fathom why we'd been ordered to attack in the way we were in the first place, or why we would stop deep inside the city and then pull back.
The impact of such incoherence, Mattis writes, cannot be overstated. Dizzying is the appropriate word.
How does it feel to be told, uh-oh, never mind?
You've got to have confidence that what you're doing is right. And if it's right to break the back of the terrorists, then do it. Just do it. Do it as well as you can. Protect the innocent to the degree you can. But don't get wobbly when the going gets tough.
And the Bush administration got wobbly.
Yes.
Okay, so there's Mattis saying that he was, quote, flabbergasted by the decision by a former president to invade Iraq. And he goes on to say that he was dizzied by the incoherence of the George W. Bush administration's policy toward Iraq. So there's Mattis in very stark terms criticizing a former president. And you have to think to yourself, if Mattis had such extreme reservations about administration policy while it was underway, what is the code of military conduct, or even just ethical conduct, which says you have to withhold those criticisms while they're underway, meaning the events that you're criticizing are transpiring, but you can nitpick in hindsight? It would make a lot more of a moral difference to actually go public with those criticisms while there can be something done to change the policy, rather than waiting, 15, 16 years later, or whatever the case may be. And that's seemingly what Mattis has done here. So if he believed that the Bush administration's policy was so flawed, and he was one of the most prominent military personnel carrying out the policy. Remember, he, as the clip mentioned, commanded the unit that took down the famous Saddam Hussein statue, and that commanded a onslaught on Fallujah that he thought was wrong-headed. Isn't it sort of incumbent on you morally to do something at the time to register your objections in a public fashion? Now, maybe that goes against some military code, but it should just tell you that the military code is not the be-all, end-all. There has to be some additional layer of ethical consideration in your calculus. And Mattis hasn't been pressed on that, and he doesn't seem particularly cognizant of that quandary. So here's another clip.
You resigned the day after the president announced that the U.S. was pulling all its troops out of Syria.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Did that decision have anything to do with your...
Absolutely it did.
But what about the decision to withdraw from Syria?
I disagree with it.
Because?
Because we need to maintain enough influence there that we don't see the same thing that happened when we withdrew from Iraq.
Mattis believed a sudden pullout would undermine the campaign against ISIS and betray allies who were fighting alongside the Americans. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "My views on treating allies with respect are strongly held."
This was how I saw the strength of America, that we keep our alliances together and keep them tight. And if I wasn't the right person to do this, then the president needed someone more aligned with his views.
This is a blunt letter.
I was honest and forthright with him about where it was that I was parting ways.
So there's Mattis confirming what pretty much everyone with a brain knew, which is that he resigned in protest of Trump's order that was issued on Twitter to withdraw all troops from Syria. But if you're watching that segment, you might get the impression that troops have actually withdrawn from Syria, which they have not. The Department of Defense is now referring to the modification of troop levels in Syria as a partial drawdown, meaning they are actually moving toward a quasi-permanent troop presence in Syria. The actual numbers of troops deployed is considered classified, so we don't have an exact figure, but reports have indicated that there are as many as 1,000 troops currently in Syria with no end in sight as in terms of that deployment. So Mattis claimed that he was resigning because he disagreed with that policy, but the policy that he was advocating, meaning a perpetual presence in Syria, has basically been carried out. So Mattis continuing to stick by that line kind of creates a false picture of the situation in Syria, and the interviewer on the part of CBS apparently doesn't have the knowledge or the interest in pushing back on that point. So here's one more clip.
As for other differences Mattis had with the president,
I will not speak ill of a sitting president. I'm not going to do it.
but he will say this.
He's an unusual president, our president is, and I think that especially with just the rabid nature of politics today, we got to be careful. We could tear this country apart.
If Mattis thought that Trump's order to withdraw from Syria was so dangerous that it would cause him to resign in protest, which is a dramatic step, then isn't it obligatory upon him to, in a sense, speak ill of the president? Not necessarily saying that he would have to run around and criticize Trump's character in egregious terms, but if he felt that he had to resign, if that was his final resort, then it should be seen, I would think, as obligatory upon him to give the rationale for that decision in a way that reflects on the commander-in-chief who issued the order that he regarded as so unacceptable. And yet he kind of phrases his reticence there in this, again, sort of formulation of military rectitude that automatically generates a certain respect. and veneration. And so, of course, apparently it doesn't occur to the interviewer to challenge him on that either. But the final point to make on this is that although Mattis comes across as this sort of just military strategist who doesn't want to get himself sullied by politics, what he's advocating for and the reasons why he resigned are obviously political issues. If you believe that the United States must keep an indefinite presence in one of the world's most dangerous hotspots in conflict zones, Syria, then you're advocating a political position. You might kind of frame it in these apolitical terms as if that doesn't entail any political decisions, but of course it does. But people who are enmeshed in the foreign policy establishment and have allies in the military establishment who seek to advance their interests tend to think of their goals as sort of beyond the realm of ordinary politics. And that sort of insulates them from criticism. And it insulates themselves from any susceptibility to a partisan back and forth. And that is dangerous in the long term because it corrodes the public's ability to really analyze foreign policy actions through the correct prism, which is that they are the product of conscious decision-making by people who are only in power as a result of political actions. And so that really ought to be pushed back against by Mattis's interviewers, although they're probably so awestruck by his majesty that they don't really feel compelled to raise those issues. Now, of course, there's the additional question of whether Mattis's military rectitude posture might have a certain financial interest for him. He continues to serve on corporate boards. And he, for example, while he was serving in the Defense Department, had very close relationships with the tech giants, including Google and Amazon. And in one instance, in a report that came out recently, Mattis offered to go to the Amazon headquarters in Seattle and personally swear in Jeff Bezos to serve on this defense advisory board. And that had to be cut off at the last second because, Jeff Bezos didn't have the correct security clearance, which you think Mattis would have looked into ahead of time. But he wanted to kind of bind together the public sphere in the Defense Department and the corporate sphere so that they're almost one and the same. And you can't get a much more picture-perfect definition of the military-industrial complex than that. And that is sort of what Mattis represents. That's sort of what he embodies. And for him to kind of act as though he's outside of ordinary politics distracts from any real evaluation of that function that he serves. So that'll do it for now. Once again, if you enjoy any of this content, please feel free to contribute financially on Patreon or PayPal. I'm not serving on any corporate boards, so your contributions are appreciated, and that information is, as always, in the description box. Talk to you later.